So as we come to this story, we've been talking through our approach to Easter, our approach to the incidents that happened around Jesus' death and his resurrection, and how the gospel stories kind of lead up to that. And so as we come to this part of the story in the Gospel of John, after looking at Luke last Sunday, before we look at the details, I just want to put it in some context. The first 12 chapters of John is known as the Book of Signs. And so in the first 12 chapters, as the gospel unfolds and John tells the story of Jesus, there's lots of stories about Jesus teaching in his public ministry, sitting on the hillsides, teaching crowds, encountering groups of people. And so there's a lot of teaching and a lot of miracles. And the miracles in John's gospel are signs that you should see that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the one that came from God and the one that they put their trust in. And so there's always the teaching, and then there are the miracles or the signs. And after every sign, there's a discourse, a discussion, an explanation of the signs. And that's the pattern throughout the first 12 chapters of John's gospel. Every miracle is a sign that Jesus is the Messiah and he has divine power, and all 12 seem to follow that pattern of miracle or sign, and then a teaching that goes with that, an understanding of it. And then the rest of the gospel from chapter 13 on, chapter 13 to 21, it pivots and it goes in a new direction. And all of a sudden, it's not Jesus' public ministry to the crowds as much as it is stories about Jesus' interaction with his inner circle, with the 12 disciples and some others that were close to them. And so that inner circle kind of learns some deeper truths about who Jesus is and what he's all about. And so it moves to the private, and there's one sign in the entire second half. From chapter 9 on, there's one sign, and the whole of that part of the gospel, that whole section, almost half of it, is moving towards that one sign, and that sign is the cross. And so as we pick up this morning in chapter 13 with our story and begin at the beginning of chapter 13, I wanted to put that in context and help you understand what's happening. That one sign is the cross, and then there's an extended explanation around it so that you understand something of the cross. If you want to understand the cross more fully, read the rest of the New Testament, particularly Paul's writings. It seems like every letter that he writes is to a church that's going through this or that, and they've got very specific situations that he's writing to, but he's always bringing them back to the cross. And so there's just this whole thing where within the Gospels, there's extended sections of explanation about the cross, like that's the centerpiece of the story of Jesus. And then in the rest of the New Testament, there's this unpacking, this unfolding of this deeply meaningful moment in human history that changed everything. And so there's kind of two halves of the story, and the story begins on a high point. So it's not just that it goes from one half to the other, but it begins on a high point in eternity. John starts his story by not just telling the story of Jesus' birth, but saying first, Jesus was in eternity. He was part of creation. Nothing was made without him. Everything was made by him and for him. He's God, and he's creating the universe, and then he comes down to earth, and he's born, and he lives his life. And so as the beginning of the gospel in those first 12 chapters happens, there's this kind of descending as Jesus comes down from being the creator of the universe, who has all the glory and all the authority, and he comes down and he's born in humble circumstances in the manger. And then he tracks with people, and some people deeply misunderstand him. And as it moves towards the center of the story, we have this low point where Jesus is rejected by the people around him, and they don't receive him or accept him. And so there's this hinge in chapter 13 where things are just starting to pick up from that low point. And so John begins our story with, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his time had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. Think about that for a minute. We're just kind of at the halfway point of the story. We're just at that pivot point where there's still going to be a lot more to the gospel story, but we're already to the point where it says Jesus knew his time had come and this was the end. So we got this story kind of telescoped out so that the end, that's all about his ending, all about his leaving this world, is starting in chapter 13. So 1 to 12, and then 9 more chapters that are all focused and stretched out that story so we can hear it and understand it in detail and gain the meaning from it. And so he begins before the Passover celebration. And this is the part of the story where Jesus leaves this world, and we're only halfway through, and it'll take the whole rest of the book to cover the story and to build up to his death on the cross where he leaves this world. And so we'll read about his arrest and his crucifixion and his resurrection and his ascension back up into heaven. So it's like a pendulum swinging from eternity, where he creates the universe, down to earth and all that he does and he teaches, to that point where it starts to pick up again with our story and eventually ends with the cross, with his death and his resurrection, and then he's back in heaven again. And it's come kind of, I'd say full circle. That's a half circle, I know. So John tells us this upswing towards Jesus' ascension starts here at the story of the Passover meal in chapter 13. And John tells us this story begins just before the Passover celebration. So with that, we know that this is the Passover just before Jesus died. And if you've been around church very long, if you were here last year with us as we worked through the story, or the year before that, or the year before that, you know, this is the point in the story where Jesus took the bread and broke it and passed it to his disciples, and took the cup and poured the wine and handed it around to them. And he said, "This is my body given for you, and this is my blood shed for you." And all 3 of the other gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all tell the story of the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup, and this deep meaning of that symbolized Jesus' death before the death actually happened. And that Jesus told them to do this in remembrance of him. And we do this kind of on a monthly cycle. We go back to that story. We do that in church to remember the centrality of the story is all around this act of him dying for us. And so John, when he tells us that it's the Passover story, he's telling us, oh, this is that meal. Except that John doesn't tell us about the bread and the wine. The other 3 all tell us that at this meal, he broke the bread, he poured the cup, he did this thing that we still do in our church on a very regular basis. And so they all tell it except John. And John tells us about this incident that we just read about that was so beautifully illustrated by Emma, the story of Jesus wrapping a towel around his waist and taking a basin and sitting at the feet of each disciple that was there for dinner and washing their feet for them. This is the Passover meal where all of that happened. And so in the 3 what we call synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tell about this incident, and Jesus teaches them by breaking the bread and pouring the cup. And yet, then the other thing that we have from the other gospels is Luke tells us that in his gospel that there's an argument among the disciples, that all of them are kind of jockeying for position, and they're all saying, well, I wonder who's going to be the most important in the kingdom of heaven. Who's going to be the greatest? And Jesus responds by teaching them about true servanthood. It says they began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them, and Jesus told them, in this world, kings and great men lord it over the people, yet they're called friends of the people. But among you, it will be different. Like out there in the world, people who are important, they lord it over the people, and they might call themselves a friend of the people, but they kind of stand a step above, and they lord their power, they lord their authority over them. You look at me, you listen to me, you give me what I'm due. And Jesus says, not among you. That's not how we do it. He tells them that among you it'll be different. Those who are greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant who is more important. The one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here. For I am with you as one who serves. That's what Luke tells us about this night. So we might wonder why John doesn't tell us about the bread and the wine, and we might wonder why the other three don't tell us about the foot washing, and we can speculate on that. We can say, well, John knew that they already had Mark's gospel. He knew about the existence of those gospels. He's writing a little later, and when he composes his gospel, he goes, you already know that part of the story, but this is part that really struck me. And so John doesn't tell about the bread and wine. They don't tell about the foot washing. And there are some who might be tempted over the years to say, well, these are two different incidents. I don't know why they got put with the same Passover meal at the end of Jesus' story. Somebody mixed up the details. These are two separate incidents. But there's something that ties them together. And if you look closely, there's kind of an overlap. So both stories are about humility that Jesus shows in his sacrificial love for us. At one point in the synoptics, they're talking about his sacrifice, that he gives himself, that he humbles himself even to death. As Paul puts it, humbles himself to death, even death on a cross. And as he breaks the bread and he pours the cup, he's talking about what it means to love and to sacrifice his life for ours. And the bread and wine represent Jesus' humble sacrifice of dying on the cross. And here in John's gospel, Jesus humbles himself by wrapping a towel around himself and by sitting at the disciples' feet and washing their feet. And so as we look at verse 2, it tells us Jesus knew the Father had given him authority over everything, and he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table and took off his robe and wrapped a towel around his waist and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. Now, last Sunday, we talked about a woman who walks into Jesus' presence at a dinner, a formal dinner with a Pharisee. And she begins to wash Jesus' feet. And even as we hear that story and consider it, we go, that's an awkward kind of moment. That woman is humbling herself in such a way that it's almost scandalous how low she goes to wash his feet with her tears and wipe them with her hair. It's awkward for everybody standing around there. Simon takes offense at it, and Jesus says, look, this is a great act of love. She loves me so much, she's done this humble act in complete contrition because she's been forgiven so much. She loves so much. And so he takes it as a sign of love. And here Jesus, the King of the universe, the one John tells us nothing was made without him. Everything was made by him and for him. He was part of that big picture of calling the entire universe into existence. And then as he unpacks the story, when he's ready to tell about the main event, and he's slowing down the story for those last 9 chapters, when he's ready to do that, he says, here's where it all began. Here's where the beginning of the end happened. He says, look, Jesus did this thing. He wrapped a towel around himself, and he started washing their feet. And suddenly, what we felt about this poor woman, that she'd humbled herself and showed this great act of devotion and love, we've got the King of the universe, the creator of everything, bending down at the feet of a bunch of guys who are flawed and human. And if you read their stories long enough, you realize they're way too much like us. And Jesus washes their feet. So it's this act of humility. They've just been talking, according to Luke's gospel, they've been spending part of their night at least talking about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and then the great ruler of the universe. The bowl of water. He quietly walks over to each one by one, and puts down the basin and grabs their feet and starts to wash them lovingly. If you look at these verses, it says Jesus knew the Father had given him authority over everything. Jesus knew that he was in charge of the entire universe. Jesus knew that he's the big shot here, and he had come from God and would return to God. So, he's in charge of everything. He has all the authority in the universe. So, he got up from the table, and he wrapped the towel. He poured the basin, and he washed their feet. He says the reason that he washed their feet is because he had authority. He's not doing it because he has to or because it's expected of him. He's not doing it because he's a slave or a lower form of life. And he says in this world, when he teaches them in Luke's gospel, when he tells them about what it means to be the greatest, he said those who want to be the greatest should be the greatest servants. And John goes, I remember the moment he grabbed that towel, and I will never forget that he came over there, and he wrapped it around himself, and he washed their feet. He washed my feet. This is the humility of the Lord, but he's not humble because he's forced to be. He's not humble because he's a slave and has no choice. He has the authority over the entire universe, and because of that authority, not in spite of it, he washes the feet of his friends gathered there to give them an example of what real greatness is and what real authority does. What he does with his power is serve. And instead of it being a reason not to serve, it's a reason why he washes feet. The Father had given him authority over everything, so he washes feet. So Jesus' humble servanthood, washing feet, is not a low point. It's not a degrading moment that he lives through in order to get to the end of the story. It's a high point because it's beginning to build up. John is saying, here's where the beginning of that part of the story that arcs up towards Jesus reestablished in eternity, the one who will rule all of eternity for all of us. And he says the beginning of that upswing is here when Jesus did this thing. But I can understand, I can relate to Peter. Jesus is going around washing their feet, and when he comes to Peter, Peter goes, this is not right. Jesus, you are the one that we worship. You shouldn't be washing my feet. He says, are you going to wash my feet? You're going to wash my feet? And Jesus replies, you don't understand what I'm doing now. You will later, but you don't understand now. And he goes, you will never, ever wash my feet. That's our Peter, right? You're not going to wash my feet. The other guys may go along with this, but I know this is wrong. You are so much higher than me. I can't have you wash my feet. It's not right. And he's right. In so many ways that we look at the world, it is not right for Jesus to wash the feet of Peter. And so he protests, you'll never wash my feet. And of course he objects. And Jesus' response is this. He says, unless I wash your feet, you won't belong to me. That statement needs some unpacking. He says, unless I wash you, you won't belong to me. So he's saying there that it's not just a matter of, Peter, you're dirty, you need help, you need to be cleansed. He's saying, unless I wash you, you won't be clean. Remember the woman that washed his feet? What did he say? He said, you have been forgiven. He tells the others that she's been forgiven, and then he looks at her and he says, you've been forgiven. He says, the reason she loves me, the reason she did this is because she loves me, and she loves me because she's been forgiven. Jesus washed her soul, and so she washes his feet as a natural response. And here Jesus says, unless I am the one who washes you, unless you get my cleansing that you really need, you won't belong to me. Now, quite often, if you look at the original words, you look at the Greek words, the Hebrew words, it's pretty much what the scriptures tell us. It's what the English translations tell us. But there's something that you need to know about this word here. You won't belong to me. And some translation says, you won't have any part with me. And both sound very different, but they in fact both fit. Because the word there in Greek is meros. And meros is a word that they would have had. It's a Greek word. And in the Old Testament, of course, the Old Testament isn't originally written in Greek. But at the time of Jesus and Peter, the entire world was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was guided by Greek culture. And so Greek language was the predominant language of the world and of trade. And so Peter would have been familiar with the Greek Old Testament. And in the Greek Old Testament, as the story of the people of God unfolds, as they talk about the Israelites and their relationship to God and how that all played out, meros is a word that's almost exclusively used, and the whole grouping of words around it is pretty much exclusively used for that time when the people of God were going through the desert and they were headed towards the promised land, right? And so God had fulfilled all of his promises to them. He'd kept the people safe in Egypt. And when he springs them from their prison there and he's leading them to the land flowing with milk and honey, the land he'd promised them, the land where they would live out their destiny to be the people of God, blessed by him in every way. As they're headed towards the promised land, there is this plan that unfolds, and they are told that they will be given a parcel of land. And in the Old Testament scriptures, it talks about each tribe and each family kind of having their spot, their part of the land. They parceled it out. And so we got stories like the story of Ruth where it becomes significant. Who owns that land? And when that one member of the family dies and that's his land, how does it stay in the family? And if people had squandered their money and foolishly let themselves get in debt, and they had to sell their land, every 7 years they'd have a year of jubilee, and the land would revert back to the family, because the family couldn't be part of the people of God without having a place in the promised land, because that was part of what it meant to be blessed by God and looked after by him. So you understand there's this significance to your spot in the land. It was your place in the people of God. It was your plot on the family nation, right? The family land. And so you were part of the people, and you lived in Israel as a people who had been nomadic, but now had a land to go with the name of their people. Every other people, they became known by the land, right? And it's we're Canadians. We live in Canada. That's the name of our place, and that's the name of our land, and that's the name of the people. But they had been a people without a land, and now they suddenly have a land that God's given them. He's led them to and put them in. And they get their peace, and it's part of that promise, part of that blessing that God gives them, that they're going to grow to know him so well, and that they'll be a blessing to all nations, because the whole world's going to learn about me through you, my people. And so when it's translated belong, it's like you will have no place of belonging, like the land that kind of represents your belonging to the people and the benefits that come from being one of the people of God. And so whether it says you have no part with me, like you have no part, literally no parcel of land, you got no space in my people, or whether it's you don't belong to me. So there's this sense in which being a part of the people of God, having that land, you were a part of God's possessions. You belonged to him, but you also had all these benefits of the land and the blessings that came with it. He was yours and you were his. You belonged and you were one of them. And so when Jesus says, look, unless you have my cleansing, unless you allow me to make you clean, you don't belong to me and I don't belong to you. You don't have a share in the plot, the place that is your place in the world. You belong to the people of God. You've got a piece of land. If you belong to Jesus, there is this part, this place that you have in life, in the world, that belongs to you because you belong to him. And so you're blessed by your sense of receiving from him, and he is yours, and you belong to him. And your loyalties and your allegiances belong to him. And Jesus is saying to Peter, you know what, as an Israelite, what it means to be a part and to get your part. But if you don't have my cleansing, if you don't allow me to make you clean, that's what happens. That's what this represents. And so when Jesus says that, he means something by it, that you have a rightful share in what it means to be part of my family. You won't belong to me captures that family part. And Peter says, then, if that's the case, then I do want in on that. So Peter hears it and thinks about this plot of land, of receiving your inheritance as an Israelite, and he goes, oh, if it's like that, then wash my feet, wash my hands, like wash my head, like if cleansing my feet gives me a part of the inheritance, like I want to show you I'm all in, and whatever blessings there are to have, I'll take them all. And Jesus replies to him, Jesus explains to him, a person who's bathed all over doesn't need to wash except for the feet to be entirely clean. And the cleansing from Jesus, in this cleansing from Jesus, Jesus is saying, my cleansing is complete. I don't need to clean you any more than I've cleaned you. This symbolic cleansing, that's just an outward sign of the inward work. And he says to his disciples, you're all clean except for one of you. So that's the part of the story where in all the Gospels they mention what happens with Judas here. And he goes, you're all clean because you're all mine. That guy, he's not with me anymore. But all the rest of you, you're mine and I'm yours. You have a part and you belong and you're part of the family of God. And that's what this means. And I'm doing this to show you and to remind you that you're part. And I'm telling you that this is how it works in my kingdom. This is what greatness looks like. Don't be walking around the world trying to jockey for position. Don't be looking to get your authority and empower yourself. But look to use every bit of power you have to serve others around you. So that night at this dinner, Jesus had passed bread and wine, representing laying down his body and sacrificing his life for ours. And he instructs his followers to remember him in that way. And he washes his disciples' feet to remind them and us that he is the one who by his death makes us clean. And John knows that Jesus' followers have other parts of the story from Mark and from the others, but now he writes his gospel and he wants us to know that what Jesus was teaching us with that basin and towel is so essential to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so Luke chooses to tell it by doing what Jesus said, by telling us what Jesus said about leadership and about being the servant of all instead of trying to lord it over others. But John says when he did that with the basin, that sunk in. And every lesson that he taught us about what it means to be his follower sunk in for me, and I realized my calling in life, the reason I exist is to follow him and to do like he does. And if he, the king of the universe, humbled himself to wash feet, then nothing is beneath me. That I am to walk around in this world and have a servant's heart in situations I walk into. I am to look to see how I can serve my people, and people who don't even know Jesus yet. So in John's way of thinking it about this story, the cross isn't a low point in the story, right? He's picking things up, and as he shows Jesus humbling himself, he says, this is the beginning of not Jesus going lower, but Jesus rising higher. This is not a sign that he's lost the authority and he needs to become a servant. It's a sign that he has authority. As it moves towards the cross and his ultimate sacrifice, he says this is not a low point of the story. In Mark's gospel, it's the low point of human history, and that's true too. But John says what he did on the cross, that is not Jesus defeated. That is Jesus exalted. That is not Jesus crucified like a criminal. That is Jesus who is king. He says when they wrote that above his cross, it was not ironic, it was truth. He says Satan meant that moment to be the worst and the darkest moment in human history. He thought that he had won by destroying Jesus and all the good that he was doing, and it was the miscalculation that is bigger than any other miscalculation in the entire universe. What he saw as a great victory for the powers of darkness was the greatest accomplishment in human history. It was Jesus paying for our sins and making a way for Peter and for all the other disciples and followers and for you and I to be clean. And we all, living in this world, stain our souls with things we do and we say. We look back at some moments in our life, and if we're honest with ourselves, they're shameful and we never should have lived them. We never should have said what we said and did what we did. But what Jesus did there makes us clean of every stain that we have put on our own souls. John says that moment this story is headed towards, it is the greatest moment in human history. What he accomplished there is so great that if you look at it as a loss, you just don't get it. And as you move towards that moment, John wants you to know what begins as a moment of just him wrapping a towel and washing some people's feet is a moment where he goes in the opposite direction of how the world expects him to go as the one who has the power and the authority, and it reverses everything, and the ways that we look at the world are flipped upside down. And so Jesus wasn't temporarily defeated at the cross. Jesus triumphed over sin and death. And his instructions that night were clear. Do as I have done to you. He says, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that is what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Then he says, do as I've done to you. I tell you the truth, slaves are not greater than their master, nor is a messenger more important than the one who sends the message. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. And in that moment, he calls us into his arc of the story. He calls us to that kind of greatness that comes from humble sacrifice and servant hearts. And so when we say that we follow Jesus, John wants us to know that that's exactly what it means to follow Jesus, to be humble and to be a servant rather than to look to be served and to get what we feel we deserve. I am so glad I don't get what I deserve, because Jesus, the great one who deserved everything, gave it all up for us.